In northern Iraq, inside a cave called Shanidar, archaeologists uncovered the skeleton of a man who should not have been alive. His right arm had been amputated above the elbow decades before he died. He was blind in one eye. He'd lost most of his teeth years earlier, and his bones showed the kind of skeletal degeneration you'd expect in someone who could barely move on his own by the end. This wasn't a modern patient in a hospital bed. This was a Neanderthal who lived roughly 45,000 years ago. And by every rule of survival of the fittest we assume governed prehistoric life, he should have died the moment he became a burden. Instead, someone kept him alive for years, maybe decades. This is the story of Shanidar I and what his skeleton proves about who ancient humans really were. Shanidar Cave sits in the Zagros Mountains of Iraqi Kurdistan, a natural shelter that Neanderthal groups used on and off for tens of thousands of years. In 1957, an American archaeologist named Ralph Solecki began excavating the site, and over the next several years, his team uncovered the remains of 10 Neanderthal individuals buried in the cave floor. One of them, labeled Shanidar I by researchers, immediately stood out. His skeleton wasn't just old or incomplete, it was catastrophically damaged, and every injury had healed. That detail matters more than almost anything else in the story. A wound that kills you leaves no evidence of healing. A wound your body has time to repair over months or years leaves bone that is visibly remodeled around the injury. Solecki's team found exactly that kind of remodeling again and again across Shanidar I's body. His right forearm and hand were missing entirely, and the bone at the point of amputation showed smooth, rounded healing, not a fresh break, not something that happened right before death. His right eye socket showed damage consistent with a blow that likely blinded him on the side, and that too had healed over. His legs showed signs of a condition that would have affected his ability to walk normally. This wasn't a man who died from his injuries. This was a man who lived with them, for what researchers estimate could have been 10 to 20 years after the worst of the damage occurred. To understand how significant that is, you have to understand what daily life required for a Neanderthal roughly 45,000 years ago. There was no agriculture, no stored grain, no permanent settlements with food surpluses sitting in reserve. Survival meant hunting, meant tracking large animals across mountain terrain, meant using both hands and full mobility to process carcasses, to make and use stone tools, to travel long distances on foot between resource sites. Shanidar I could do almost none of that unassisted. Missing his right forearm meant he couldn't grip a spear the way a two-handed hunter could. Blind in one eye meant a significant loss of depth perception, which matters enormously when you're throwing a weapon or judging the distance to a running animal. And the leg pathology many researchers have identified suggests he likely walked with a pronounced limp, possibly relying on a stick or the support of others just to move around the cave. Add to that the tooth loss by the time he died in his 40s, which was already an advanced age for a Neanderthal. He'd lost most of his teeth, and the ones that remained showed heavy wear consistent with using his mouth to compensate for the tasks his missing hand couldn't perform. Every single one of these conditions on its own would have made him significantly less capable of feeding himself. Combined, they describe a man who most likely could not hunt, could not process his own food without help, and could not travel without support. And yet, the bone evidence is unambiguous. He didn't die when these injuries happened. He lived on for years inside a small mobile hunting group where every member's contribution to survival mattered. This is where the science gets interesting because for decades after Solecki's discovery, anthropologists debated exactly what the skeleton proved. The most direct explanation is also the most human one. His group cared for him. They shared food with him even when he couldn't hunt. They likely helped him move between camps. They kept him alive not because he was useful in an economic sense, but because he was one of them. This idea became known as the Shanidar hypothesis of Paleolithic compassion, and for years, it was treated as one of the strongest pieces of evidence that Neanderthals were capable of complex social bonds and empathy, not the brutish, purely instinct-driven creatures they'd long been portrayed as in popular imagination. But more recent researchers have pushed back on parts of that framing, and it's worth being honest about the disagreement rather than presenting it as settled. Some scientists, including anthropologist Penny Spikins, have pointed out that surviving with an amputated arm and reduced mobility wouldn't have been as immediately fatal as older assumptions suggested. A Neanderthal missing one hand could still contribute to group tasks, could still process materials with his teeth and remaining limb, and might not have needed constant hour-by-hour care to survive. In other words, the debate isn't about whether Shanidar 1 received support. The healed bone makes that undeniable. Someone at some point had to help him through the acute injury and recovery phase, particularly the amputation and the head trauma that blinded him. The debate is about how much ongoing care that support required and what it tells us about the depth of Neanderthal social bonds versus simple pragmatic tolerance. Either reading still overturns the old stereotype. Even the more conservative interpretation requires a group willing to keep a visibly disabled member alive and traveling with them for years. So what did that actually look like day to day? Picture a Neanderthal band, likely no more than 15 to 20 individuals, moving through the Zagros foothills as the seasons changed, following game animals up and down the mountain slopes. Shanidar 1 would have moved with them, likely near the middle or back of the group, probably using a length of wood as a support for his damaged leg. At a kill site, he wouldn't have been the one bringing down the animal, but butchering and processing a carcass took many hands, cutting, scraping hides, cracking bone for marrow, and a man with one working arm and strong teeth could still contribute to parts of that work. Around the fire at night, he'd have been fed a share of the meat like anyone else, not because a formal rule demanded it, but because in a group that size, everyone's survival was bound together. There was no surplus economy where a disabled member could be quietly written off. There was also no framework where he'd automatically be abandoned either. What the evidence increasingly suggests is something more mundane and, in a way, more powerful than a simple story of heroic compassion. A group of Neanderthals who simply continued to include an injured member in their daily life because that's what a functioning social group does, not extraordinary charity. Just ordinary belonging repeated every day for years until it became evidence written directly into the bone. When Ralph Selecki first published his findings in the 1960s, he called Shanidar 1 the old man and argued his survival proved Neanderthals possessed genuine compassion, a claim that helped begin dismantling the caveman stereotype that had dominated public imagination for a century. That stereotype painted Neanderthals as slow, brutish, incapable of anything beyond raw survival instinct. A single skeleton riddled with old, healed injuries quietly dismantled that idea. Whatever the exact mechanism, deep emotional bonds, practical group cohesion, or some combination of both, the fact remains inscribed in his bones. Someone helped him through the worst of it. Someone kept feeding him afterward, and he lived on for years inside a community that, by the strict logic of survival of the fittest, had every incentive to leave him behind. They didn't. 45,000 years later, in a cave in the Zagros Mountains, that decision is the only thing that survived. Not the meat they ate, not the tools they carried, not their names. Just the proof written directly into a set of century-old bones that even in the depths of the Ice Age, being human, or in this case, being Neanderthal, meant something more than simply surviving alone.